Welcome back to Session 5 of this faith group series on King Solomon, a man lured away from God's heart. I hope it's been an interesting journey through Solomon's life so far and that you've had some good discussion together. As I begin this study, I recall a discussion that happened years ago at a men's Bible study. Don't remember exactly why or how the topic came up, but the men there began discussing the Great Depression. A number of them had lived through it and had vivid memories of the hardship and struggle of those years. And they admitted that when they grew up and had children of their own, they were determined to spare them from any of those hardships, and naturally enough. And yet, as the conversation went on, those men also recognized a kind of disturbing irony in that determination. And that is, they knew that the struggles of the Depression, as hard as they were, had built character and strength, perseverance and grit in them. And that the next generations, spared from that crucible of suffering, just had less strength and perseverance, grit, and character. And so they ended up saying that they wouldn't wish the experience of the Great Depression on anyone, even their worst enemy, and yet they saw value in it. The value that came out of it. Whereas the wealth and ease that the next generations experienced hadn't served them nearly as well. Well, I noted way back in Session 1 that Solomon really faced no enemies and very few obstacles as king of Israel. He was born to wealth and privilege and gained much more of both through his reign. God gave him wisdom which may have made him feel almost invincible. And you have to wonder, if Solomon had had to struggle the way his father David did, would it have strengthened him? Would it have given him better character? Well, you have to wonder because of the sad turn that Solomon's life took in his later years. Again, in Session 1, we saw how well he had begun his reign. When God came to him at Gibeon, he was humble before him. He asked for wisdom rather than any selfish gifts, and he seemed very mature for being young and new to the throne. And God gave him great wisdom, discernment, along with every other blessing he could possibly have wanted. But tragically, Solomon's pride and ambition led him to squander all of that. It's a pretty stiff competition, but certainly 1 Kings chapter 11 has to be in the running for one of the saddest chapters in the entire Bible, certainly in the entire biblical history. In verse 1, the author says with obvious distaste, Solomon loved many foreign women. And the author assumed that the reader would just know that that violated the law of Moses. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 3 and 4, prohibited the Israelites from marrying their pagan neighbors. Do not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons, for that would turn away your children from following me to serve other gods. And of course, when the author said that Solomon loved many foreign women, he wasn't kidding. Solomon ended up with 700 wives and 300 concubines. Now, it's almost certain that the vast majority of those marriages were to seal diplomatic alliances. That was the practice among the royal families right up until World War I, actually. But the fact that it was commonly done among royalty, and it was the way that you made alliances, really doesn't lessen the offense of it. In fact, there was a double tragedy in this wretched excess of Solomon's harem. First, in 1 Kings 11, verse 2, it says, Solomon clung to these in love. he was blinded by his lust for and pride in this enormous harem of women. And that humble desire to serve God that we heard back in 1 Kings 3 seems nowhere in sight. I expect you've all heard that rather crude reference to men especially thinking with a part of their body other than their brains. Well, it seems Solomon fell into that trap, and his vaunted wisdom just flew out the window. But also, what a sad, lonely, miserable life for nearly all of these princesses and concubines. No doubt most of them were sent away from a foreign land to live in Israel, probably when they were quite young. For centuries, royal princesses were taught that their sole purpose in life was to bear an heir for the dynasty, for the royal family. And yet math alone proves that few of these 1,000 women ever came into Solomon's bed. And even if the man was a machine, it would have been like a triennial experience. So just imagine the catfights in the dormitories. These poor women tried to vie for position and for the king's attention. In that context, it would have been all that gave their lives value. And so Solomon's marrying and clinging to all these foreign women not only ignored the sixth commandment, you shall not commit adultery, but it was brutally unloving treatment of these women, even if they did live in the lap of luxury. Far worse, however, was Solomon's enthusiastic adoption of idolatry. Now, this is perfectly predictable given that warning that we read from Deuteronomy 7. And it's interesting that there's no hint anywhere here that Solomon tried to convert his wives to the worship of the God of Israel. It only went the other way around. And even if diplomatic marriages were unavoidable at that time, he didn't need to build them shrines and chapels to maintain their idolatrous worship. And he especially should never have joined them in the worship of their gods. I mean, that was, first of all, a gross violation of the first and most important commandment. God declared to Israel, I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. To have no other God was essential for Israel being God's chosen people. And so to worship the idols of these princesses was bad enough as Solomon's own personal sin. But it also betrayed the Sinai covenant. In fact, it betrayed the very nation that Solomon served as king. Plus, it's not as if he hadn't been warned. Recall the conditions that God put on his promises to Solomon back at Gibeon when he had the dream, and again when the temple was dedicated in Jerusalem. I mean, following his wives into idolatry put his entire dynasty at risk. I mean, this was prideful and foolish, tragic, and utterly unfaithful. And all of that is only amplified by the vicious qualities of these pagan gods. The author of 1 Kings refers to them as abominations. And that's not just Jewish defensiveness or somehow favoritism for Israel's God. The demands and the practices of paganism really were abominable. For example, they mention Moloch. The worship of Moloch commonly included sacrificing human children. And none of the idols were thought to care about their nations or the peoples who worshiped them. Rather, they had to be bribed and coddled and cajoled to provide what the people needed. And so the people who followed the idols worshipped in desperation and fear, not in trust, much less love. You know, sadly, there's a little resurgence today of people claiming to be pagans and worshiping pagan gods. I think it's just a way to rebel. But either they have no idea what they're really getting into, or else it's not really paganism, but just a kind of a variation of secular humanism. As Christians, we don't believe that the pagan gods exist the way they're portrayed, but pagan worship is still nothing to fool around with. It's an open invitation for the powers of evil to mess up our lives. And so as its end drew near, Solomon's life became very tragic, but also highly ironic. Back in session 2, we noted that Solomon is credited with writing much of the book of Proverbs. And whether it came from his own hand or whether from a wisdom school he founded, Solomon certainly should have known the Proverbs. And so it is really bitter to read Proverbs 16, verse 18. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. That verse is better known as a kind of adage in the language of the old King James Version. Pride goeth before a fall. Well, it's hard not to conclude that Solomon's pride, wisdom, and wealth caused him to feel invulnerable, that he could do whatever he wanted. But as we'll see in the last session next time, his foolishness boomeranged on him and indeed on the whole nation. Solomon became a living illustration, a cautionary tale of his own advice in Proverbs 16. One obsession of modern biblical scholarship is trying to determine when the various books of the Bible were written, and frankly, it's impossible to nail down. But many were likely, very likely, written long after the events they describe, just as history books are to this day. Well, one of those that is suspected of being written after the events it describes is the book of Deuteronomy. It's written, of course, as Moses' speech, final speech to the Israelites before they crossed the Jordan River into the Promised Land. But it may well have been written sometime well after Solomon's reign. Now, we don't need to consider the evidence for why some scholars suspect that, but the possibility of it casts a really interesting light on Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 to 20. It reads, "When you have come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you say, 'I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me,' you may indeed set over you a king whom the Lord your God will choose. Even so, he must not acquire many horses for himself, or return the people to Egypt in order to acquire more horses. Since the Lord has said to you, you must never return that way again. And he must not acquire many wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. Also silver and gold he must not acquire in great quantity for himself. When he has taken the throne of his kingdom, he shall have a copy of this law written for him in the presence of the Levitical priests. It shall remain with him, and he shall read in it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, diligently observing all the words of this law and these statutes, neither exalting himself over other members of the community, nor turning aside from the commandment, so that he and his descendants may reign long over his kingdom in Israel." Well, that is either the most deadly accurate prophecy ever made, or it was written after Solomon in light of his many failings. Because every fault that the king should avoid in that Deuteronomy passage is one that Solomon embraced. His reign was again a cautionary tale for the dangers of wealth and power, of wisdom and excess. And that can't help but bring Solomon's wisdom into question. It's not that God did not, in fact, make him wise, just as he promised and as Solomon requested back at Gibeon, but rather Solomon lost track of that gift. Perhaps lost track of the fact that it was a gift and came to think of it instead as his personal possession. And pride caused him to squander that wisdom God gave him, and indeed to betray the God who gave it to him. And so in the end, tragically, Solomon was a man lured away from God's own heart. And the worst part of all is that he himself did the luring. Well, thanks for being a part of this faith group study. I hope you now have some great conversation together in your small groups. We'll see you for the next session, and we'll see you